By the time Rosalind Hale reached Sable Creek, Wyoming Territory, the account of her flight had already beaten her there, carried west by a telegraph line considerably faster than any train could manage, and she stepped off the platform, already a topic of conversation rather than a stranger. A reward notice had gone out from her hometown 3 states east, posted by a man named Garrett Coyle, claiming she had broken a marriage contract and absconded with property that was rightfully his, and though the notice named no crime the law could actually enforce, it had done its damage regardless, painting her in every town along the rail line as a woman who could not be trusted to keep her word. She had not broken any contract worth the name. Garrett Coyle had held her father's considerable debts and had proposed marriage as the price of forgiving them, a bargain her father, ashamed and desperate, had all but forced upon her. And Rosalind had endured 8 months of Garrett's controlling attention before she understood, fully and without doubt, that the man intended to own her every bit as thoroughly as he owned her father's mortgage. She had run the night she found the second set of account books, the ones proving Garrett had been systematically ruining smaller ranchers throughout the county for years to buy up their land at a fraction of its worth, and she had taken nothing with her but a single satchel and the clothes on her back. "The whole valley knows I ran from him," she told the widow, who ran Sable Creek's boarding house on her first evening in town, delivering the confession plainly before the gossip could deliver it for her, on the theory that a truth spoken first carried less power to wound than a truth discovered second-hand. Widow Mercer, a sharp-eyed woman who had buried a husband of her own to circumstances she rarely discussed, studied Rosalind for a long moment and told her that Sable Creek judged a person by what they did in this town, not by whatever notice had chased them here, and that she was welcome to stay as long as she needed. Bartholomew Fenwick, who ran the largest cattle operation within 20 miles of Sable Creek, heard the story within his first week of its circulating, delivered to him second-hand by a ranch hand who considered it valuable gossip. He listened to the account, the broken engagement, the reward notice, the accusations of theft, and found himself considerably more curious about the woman than wary of her, a reaction that surprised even him, given how carefully he'd guarded himself against complicated entanglements, since his own marriage had ended in quiet heartbreak some years before. He met her properly at the Sable Creek Mercantile, where she had taken work behind the counter to support herself, while Widow Mercer's hospitality stretched only so far, and their first real conversation began, unglamorously, over a disagreement about the correct change for a sack of flour. Rosalind corrected his arithmetic with a directness that surprised him, and Bartholomew, rather than taking offense, found himself laughing at his own error and telling her plainly that he appreciated a person willing to be right rather than merely polite. It was a small exchange, but it lodged itself somewhere in his memory the way few small exchanges did. "I have watched a great many towns decide, within a single week, exactly what to think of a newcomer arriving under a cloud of rumor, and Sable Creek proved no different, splitting cleanly between those willing to judge Rosalind on the reward notice alone, and those, like Widow Mercer and increasingly Bartholomew himself, willing to withhold judgment until they'd formed their own opinion of the woman, rather than borrowing someone else's. Rosalind spent her first weeks in Sable Creek, bracing for the whispered judgment she'd encountered in every town along the rail line, the sideways glances, the conversations that quieted whenever she entered a room, and she found instead a town considerably more divided and considerably less predictable than she had expected. Some customers at the mercantile treated her with open suspicion, counting their change twice, as though she might have palmed a coin, while others, Widow Mercer chief among them, went out of their way to make her feel welcome, inviting her to church socials and quilting circles with a warmth she had nearly forgotten how to accept gracefully. She wrote, in those early weeks, a short letter to her father, the only family she had left, despite everything his debts had cost her, telling him plainly that she had found work and lodging and did not intend to return east, regardless of what pressure Garrett Coyle might bring to bear on him. She received no reply for months and told herself she had expected as much, though the silence still cost her something each time she checked the Sable Creek post office and found nothing waiting. Bartholomew returned to the mercantile considerably more often than his ranch's supply needs strictly required, a fact Rosalind noticed within the second week and chose, cautiously, not to discourage. He never once asked her directly about the reward notice or the broken engagement, though she understood he had certainly heard every version of the story circulating through town, and his restraint struck her as its own kind of courtesy, a willingness to let her share what she wished to share, rather than demanding an accounting he felt entitled to. She told him anyway. Eventually, on an evening he'd walked her home from the mercantile after closing, laying out the truth plainly rather than the gossip's exaggerated version, Garrett's debt-driven proposal, the second set of account books, the systematic ruin of smaller ranches she'd uncovered in Garrett's ledgers before she fled. Bartholomew listened without interrupting, and when she finished he told her, with a quiet anger that surprised her, that a man who controlled a woman through her father's debts and ruined honest ranchers for profit deserved considerably worse than a mere broken engagement, and that whatever Sable Creek's gossips believed, he counted her flight as the bravest decision available to her, rather than any kind of theft. "He didn't deserve you," Bartholomew told her plainly, the first time he'd said the words that would come to matter so much later, and Rosalind found herself unexpectedly moved by the simple certainty in his voice, a certainty entirely absent from the careful, suspicious way most of Sable Creek still regarded her. She had grown so accustomed to being weighed and found wanting that a man's uncomplicated defense landed with more force than she quite knew how to accept gracefully. Their courtship, once begun, proceeded with a steadiness that surprised them both: Sunday suppers at Widow Mercer's boarding house, long walks along Sable Creek's namesake stream, while Bartholomew described the ranch he'd built from almost nothing after his own difficult marriage had ended. Quiet evenings where Rosalind found herself talking more openly than she had with anyone since childhood. She began, slowly, to trust that Sable Creek might yet become the home she had been searching for since the night she fled Garrett Coyle's house, with nothing but a satchel and her own resolve. Not everyone in town shared Bartholomew's generous read of the situation. A local banker named Elmer Truscott, who did considerable business with ranchers across several territories and had heard an unflattering account of Rosalind, directly from an associate of Garrett Coyle's, took to warning Bartholomew privately that he was courting trouble alongside a wanted woman, regardless of whatever softer version of events she'd told him. Bartholomew heard the warning out fully and told Truscott, evenly, that he trusted his own judgment of a person's character considerably more than he trusted second-hand gossip filtered through a man with financial ties to the very person Rosalind had fled. Rosalind heard about Truscott's warning from Widow Mercer, who had it in turn from the banker's own wife, and she found herself, despite her growing trust in Bartholomew, bracing once more for the familiar pattern of a man's affection, cooling once outside voices grew loud enough to matter. She raised the subject directly the next time they walked together, asking him plainly whether Truscott's warnings troubled him at all, and Bartholomew told her, without hesitation, that a banker who did business with men like Garrett Coyle had considerably less standing to judge character than the woman standing in front of him ever had. That conversation, more than any other that autumn, convinced Rosalind that Bartholomew's steadiness was not merely the absence of complaint, but something closer to a deliberate choice he renewed each time circumstances gave him reason to reconsider it. She began, from that evening forward, to let herself imagine a future in Sable Creek, not as a temporary refuge, but as an actual home. A shift in her thinking she had not permitted herself since the night she'd fled Garrett's house with nothing but a satchel. The first sign of real trouble arrived that autumn, in the shape of a quiet stranger who took a room at Sable Creek's hotel and spent his days asking careful questions around town, ostensibly about cattle prices, but always circling, eventually, toward the whereabouts and habits of a woman answering Rosalind's description. Widow Mercer noticed the pattern first, having grown suspicious of any guest who asked more questions than his stated business required, and she warned Rosalind directly, rather than let the matter develop further unwatched. Rosalind recognized the danger immediately, understanding that Garrett Coyle's reach extended considerably further than a single reward notice, and that a man capable of ruining honest ranchers through manipulated debt was more than capable of hiring someone to track down a woman who'd escaped his control, with evidence of his crimes still fresh in her memory, if not in her actual possession. She told Bartholomew everything she knew about the stranger, and he in turn spoke quietly with Sable Creek's sheriff, a steady man named Tom Whitlock, who had little patience for outside interference in his town's affairs, regardless of what money stood behind it. The stranger, confronted directly by Sheriff Whitlock and asked plainly to state his business or leave town, admitted eventually that he had been sent by Garrett Coyle to confirm Rosalind's location and report back, though he claimed, likely truthfully, that he had no further instructions beyond that simple reconnaissance. He left Sable Creek within the day, but the confirmation of his mission left Rosalind considerably more frightened than she let show, understanding now that Garrett had not forgotten her and did not intend to let the matter rest quietly. Bartholomew found her that evening sitting alone by Sable Creek's stream, further along than her usual walking distance, and he sat beside her without immediately speaking, giving her the space to gather herself before pressing for words. When she finally spoke, she told him she feared she had brought danger to a town that had shown her nothing but undeserved kindness, and that perhaps the fairest thing she could do for everyone, himself especially, was to move on before Garrett's reach caught up with her fully. Bartholomew took her hand and told her, with the same plain certainty he'd shown from their very first real conversation, that running further would only teach Garrett Coyle that his intimidation worked, and that he had no intention of watching her flee a second time when Sable Creek, and he himself, were fully capable of standing against whatever Garrett chose to send their way. "He didn't deserve you the first time," he told her again, "and I'll be damned if I let him chase you out a second." And Rosalind, hearing the resolve in his voice, allowed herself, cautiously, to believe that this particular fight might finally be one she did not have to face entirely alone. Sheriff Whitlock, informed fully of the situation by Bartholomew the following morning, sent a careful telegram of his own to a federal land office contact he trusted, inquiring quietly whether any formal complaints had ever been filed against a man named Garrett Coyle regarding manipulated ranch debts, a question he asked less out of certainty than out of the plain instinct of a lawman who had learned to trust patterns over the years. The reply took the better part of a week to arrive, and when it finally did, it confirmed considerably more than Whitlock had expected, an active, if still quiet federal inquiry already circling Garrett's business practices across 3 territories. Rosalind, told of the telegram's contents, felt something shift in her chest that she had not expected, a loosening of the old shame that had followed her west alongside the reward notice, replaced slowly by the understanding that the truth she had carried alone for over a year might finally matter to someone with the power to act on it. Garrett Coyle himself arrived in Sable Creek 3 weeks later, traveling by private coach with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to having his demands met wherever he presented them, and he made directly for the mercantile where he knew, thanks to his hired man's earlier reconnaissance, that he would find Rosalind at her counter. He entered with a practiced, reasonable smile, the same expression Rosalind remembered from the earliest months of their engagement, before she had learned what lay beneath the pleasant surface, and he addressed her by the pet name he'd once used, as though 8 months of controlling cruelty and a year's separation had never happened at all. Rosalind kept her composure through sheer force of will, informing him plainly, in front of the mercantile's other customers, that she had no business remaining with him, and considerable evidence of his fraudulent dealings, still fresh in her memory, should he press the matter any further. Garrett's pleasant expression flickered, briefly, into something considerably colder, and he told her, quietly enough that only she could hear, that her father's remaining debts could be called due within the week if she continued to embarrass him with this small-town performance of independence. Word reached Bartholomew's ranch within the hour, carried by a mercantile customer who'd witnessed the confrontation and ridden out immediately to warn him, and Bartholomew arrived in town before Garrett had finished his supper at the hotel, finding the man holding court in the dining room with the easy confidence of someone who assumed his money would settle any local difficulty. Bartholomew introduced himself plainly and asked Garrett directly whether he intended to leave Sable Creek peaceably or whether the matter required Sheriff Whitlock's involvement. Garrett, sizing up Bartholomew with the same calculating look he likely applied to every rancher whose land he'd ever acquired through manipulated debt, suggested that Bartholomew might not fully understand what he was interfering with, and that men who crossed Garrett Coil typically found their business dealings considerably more difficult afterward across several territories. Bartholomew answered that his cattle sold on their own merit, and his bank held no debt to any institution Garrett Coil controlled, and that whatever power the man held over other men elsewhere carried no weight at all in Sable Creek. Sheriff Whitlock arrived shortly after, summoned by the hotel's proprietor, and informed Garrett plainly that Wyoming Territory recognized no legal claim over a woman who had broken no actual law, and that continued harassment of a Sable Creek resident would result in charges considerably more serious than the fraudulent reward notice he'd posted 3 states east. Garrett, faced with a united front of rancher, sheriff, and a town evidently unwilling to be intimidated by outside money, retreated to his coach that same evening, though not before delivering one final, quiet threat to Rosalind about the reach of his influence. "He didn't deserve you," Bartholomew told her again, once Garrett's coach had finally departed down the Sable Creek road, and this time he said it standing directly beside her, rather than beside a stream in private conversation, in full view of the town that had gathered to watch the confrontation resolve itself. "He never deserved a single day of your attention, and every one of us standing here tonight is glad you finally understood that, before it cost you everything." The town's response to that confrontation settled, for good, whatever doubts had lingered among Sable Creek's more cautious residents about where Rosalind's true character lay. Elmer Truscott, who had watched the entire exchange from the hotel dining room's edge, found himself reassessing his earlier warnings against the plain evidence of a wealthy stranger's threats and a woman's calm, unflinching refusal to be intimidated by them. He said nothing that evening, but he began, from that week forward, greeting Rosalind at the bank with a courtesy considerably warmer than his earlier suspicion had shown. Widow Mercer, hearing the full account from 3 separate witnesses before the night was through, told Rosalind over breakfast the next morning that Sable Creek had just watched her pass the only test that had ever truly mattered. Not the reward notice or the gossip that preceded her, but the plain fact of how she carried herself when a genuine threat finally arrived at her door. Garrett Coil's fraudulent dealings caught up with him considerably faster than anyone in Sable Creek anticipated, thanks in part to Rosalind's own careful memory of the account books she'd once glimpsed, and in part to a federal land office investigator who had been quietly building a case against manipulated ranch debts across 3 territories for the better part of a year. Rosalind, once she understood an official investigation was already underway, provided a detailed account of what she remembered from Garrett's ledgers, testimony that meaningfully strengthened a case already gathering considerable momentum against him. The reward notice that had followed her west, it turned out, carried no legal standing whatsoever, having been posted privately rather than through any proper law enforcement channel, and Sheriff Whitlock made a point of confirming this publicly at the Sable Creek General Store, ensuring that whatever residual doubt lingered among the town's more cautious residents was finally, thoroughly put to rest. Elmer Truscott, the banker who had warned Bartholomew away from Rosalind months earlier, found himself in the uncomfortable position of having vouched, however indirectly, for a man now facing serious federal charges, and he offered Rosalind a stiff, embarrassed apology she accepted with more grace than his earlier suspicion had probably deserved. Widow Mercer, watching the whole affair resolve itself from the comfortable position of having believed in Rosalind from the very first evening, remarked to anyone who'd listen that Sable Creek had gotten considerably lucky the day Rosalind Hale stepped off that train, gaining a resident of real character rather than the troublemaker the reward notice had painted her as. Rosalind, hearing the compliment secondhand, found herself finally able to accept the town's growing warmth without the old defensive flinch she'd carried since her arrival. Garrett Coyle was arrested the following spring in a neighboring territory, undone finally by the accumulated testimony of ranchers he'd defrauded across 3 counties, Rosalind's account among the most detailed and damning of them all. The federal investigator who had led the case wrote Rosalind a formal letter of thanks, noting that her recollection of the ledgers, precise down to specific figures she had glimpsed only briefly the night she fled, had closed gaps in the case that other witnesses' testimony had left dangerously open. Bartholomew read the news to her from a territorial newspaper on their own porch, and Rosalind listened to the account of Garrett's downfall with a complicated mixture of relief and something close to grief for the 8 lost months of her life his control had cost her, feelings Bartholomew allowed her to sit with fully rather than rushing her toward easy celebration. "I spent a long while believing I had run from him in shame," Rosalind told Bartholomew that evening, "and it has taken this whole town, and you most of all, to teach me I ran from him in courage instead, and that the whole valley, knowing my story, was never the disgrace I once feared it to be." Her father wrote at last, that same spring, a short and awkward letter that nonetheless carried a genuine apology for the bargain he'd once pressed upon her, admitting that Garrett's arrest had finally shown him plainly the true character of the man he'd nearly bound his daughter to. Rosalind read the letter twice before answering it, allowing herself a measure of grace toward a man who had failed her badly but had, in his own slow way, finally found his way to honesty. She wrote back inviting him to visit Sable Creek, should he ever wish to see the life she'd built for herself. An invitation she extended without pressure and without any real expectation he would accept it. Bartholomew proposed to Rosalind that same spring, not on any particularly romantic occasion, but on an ordinary Tuesday, while they stood together at the exact stretch of stream where he had once told her he wouldn't let Garrett chase her out a second time, a spot that had, over the intervening months, quietly become theirs. He told her he had no interest in a grand gesture that might overshadow the plainer truth underneath it, that he simply could not imagine building the rest of his ranch, or his life, without her steady presence beside him. They married at the Sable Creek church that June, with Widow Mercer serving as matron of honor and Sheriff Whitlock standing witness alongside half the town that had once split so sharply over how to judge a stranger arriving under a cloud of rumor. Even Elmer Truscott attended, having spent the intervening months working diligently to rebuild the trust his earlier suspicion had cost him, and he offered the newly married couple a generous wedding gift that Rosalind accepted as the genuine apology it was clearly meant to convey. The mercantile owner, glad to keep Rosalind on in whatever capacity suited her new life, offered her a partnership in the business, rather than mere counterwork, recognizing in her the same sharp arithmetic and steady judgment that had first caught Bartholomew's attention over a disputed sack of flour. Rosalind accepted, building alongside her ranch duties a small but genuine independence that ensured she would never again find herself as financially trapped as her father's debts had once left her. Sable Creek, in the years that followed, told and retold the account of Garrett Coyle's downfall and Rosalind's part in it, until the tale became something close to local legend, a cautionary account of outside money meeting a town unwilling to be bought, and a woman brave enough to testify against the very man who'd once controlled her fully. Rosalind never much minded the retellings, having long since made peace with the fact that her flight, once a source of shame she'd tried to outrun, had become instead the opening chapter of the life she'd actually wanted all along. Bartholomew told her once, years into their marriage, sitting on the porch watching their own children chase each other through the yard, that he had known within a single disputed arithmetic error at the mercantile counter that she was worth building an entire life around, and that every difficult month that followed, Garrett's pursuit included, had only confirmed what he'd already privately decided that very first evening. "He didn't deserve you," Bartholomew said one final time. "But I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you never again have to wonder whether you're deserving of everything good that comes your way." Rosalind's father did eventually visit, 2 years into the marriage, arriving unannounced on an autumn afternoon, considerably humbled by the journey, and by everything Garrett's downfall had cost him, to finally understand. He stayed a week, watched his daughter run half a mercantile and half a household with the same steady confidence Bartholomew had first noticed over a disputed sack of flour, and told her, before he left, that he was prouder of the life she'd built for herself than he had ever managed to tell her about anything before. It was not the reconciliation Rosalind had once dreamed of as a girl, but it was honest, and by then, honest had become the only currency she truly valued.